Welcome everyone again. My name is Melanie Blake and I'm the Director of Classical Pursuits. And I'm here with our very special guest, Bryn Turnbull. Bryn's the best-selling author of 4 historical novels, most recently The Berlin Apartment, published just last month. Buy it or read it in time for our December conversation. Tonight, we're going to be talking about her second novel, The Paris Deception, and I'm going to turn it over to Bryn in just a moment. Before we do, a couple of notes about tonight's program and about Classical Pursuits. So as I mentioned, we are going to be recording the presentation, and all subscribers to our newsletter will have the recording sent to you along with extra resources, info about how you can connect with Bryn through her website, on Instagram, if you live in the Toronto area, with some of her upcoming events and more. And if you've not yet subscribed to the Classical Pursuits newsletter Convivium, I invite you to do that on our website. We send a newsletter about twice a month. We never send any spam. We don't sell addresses or anything like that. And all of you who are here tonight and are subscribed to our newsletter will be entered in a draw to win some signed copies of The Paris Deception and some of Bryn's other novels. So be sure to sign up for our newsletter. We do have some new people in the audience tonight, so I'll just very briefly introduce Classical Pursuits. Together with our travel partner, WWII, we organize small group tours and seminars for people who are passionate about literature and the arts. We do offer regular presentations like this one tonight with Bryn, but our true love and our raison d'etre are these small group tours and seminars, programs where you can really make deep connections with art and literature and learn in community. And we're thrilled to have Bryn as a special host on a new tour, Art and Resistance in World War II Paris and Champagne, from May 15th to 24th, 2025. This is going to be a really special tour. I was in France this past spring developing the itinerary, and I'm just so excited about it. And we'll start in Paris, where we'll walk some of the same streets as Bryn's characters in The Paris Deception, and of course, the same streets that many 20th century Parisians, both courageous and notorious, walked, with our two really top-notch walking tour guides, Lisa Passold and Samuel Barrantes Lopez. Will be going to the Marais, to Montparnasse, the Invalides, the Place Vendôme, and the Hotel Scribe. Lots of places that I know Bryn knows very well from her research. Lots of places that are associated with Paris during World War II. And in Champagne, we'll be based in Lens, where we'll be visiting the place where the surrender to end the war in Europe was signed, the truly incredible cathedral, which is as impressive as Notre Dame, but a lot less crowded. Although, well, no crowds in Notre Dame right now, but it's pretty, I think it's almost ready to reopen. But the Reims Cathedral is really just as extraordinary. And our hotel, our fantastic hotel, is right across the street from the cathedral. We'll also be visiting the really spectacular, over-the-top Pommery Champagne House and some other smaller champagne houses as well, that showcasing the different styles of champagne in the region. On this tour, we're going to discuss 2 books, Bryn's The Paris Deception and The Suite Française in translation by Irène Nemirovsky. This is a chronicle of the early days of the German occupation, an unfinished work because Irène Nemirovsky was deported, I think first to, not to Drancy, first to like a detention camp in France, and then to a concentration camp where she died. But the first part of this work, which was meant to be a 5-volume work, the first 2 parts have quickly become a modern classic. And we have more programs connected to this tour. On October 7th, Lisa Passold, one of our walking tour guides, she'll be talking to you free about the friendship between Jean-Paul Sartre, Simone de Beauvoir, and Albert Camus, a friendship that formed during World War II. And Bryn and Samuel will also be announcing more programs soon. In January, we have a seminar on All the Light We Cannot See with Anthony Durr. And if you registered for the tour, you get 50% off this seminar. And I know that many of you are very keen to register. I know you've been asking, rightly so. And Worldwide Quest has let me know that they will be ready with the full registration info and detailed itinerary next week. We'll be sure to get that out to you. So thanks for your patience. Welcome, Bryn. As I said, Bryn Turnbull is the best-selling author of The Paris Deception and 3 other novels, including The Berlin Apartment. Her first novel, The Woman Before Wallace, was one of the top 10 best-selling works of Canadian fiction in 2020. She studied English at McGill University and has an MLit in creative writing from the University of St. Andrews in Scotland. Her books are unputdownable. I've enjoyed all of them so much, and I'm really honored to have Bryn with us here today. Bryn, over to you.
Oh, thanks so much, Melanie. I really appreciate that.
You're welcome.
Hi, everybody. It's so nice to be chatting with all of you and to be thinking about this incredible tour that we're going to be going on. I am so excited for it. I have a question for you, though, because you were there more recently than I was. Can you still smell the fire smoke at Notre Dame? Because when I was there doing the research for the book in 2022, I think, it still smelled like fire, like smoke at Notre Dame. It was quite something.
Yeah, not that I noticed. I was with Samuel, we were standing in front of the hotel, the main town hall in France, or in Paris, the Hotel de Ville, kind of. So we were across from the other side. So and then I was later behind at one of the Holocaust memorials. So I wasn't like right in front. I was behind, but I didn't smell it. And I think they were really almost done. They were supposed to be done for the Olympics and then not, but you could tell there had been a lot of progress made. And I think they are almost done with all the renovation, or all the reconstruction rather.
Oh, good. I know. I remember being so struck when that happened, thinking, oh gosh, we are living through a historical moment watching this happen. So I'm glad it's coming back and it's rising from the ashes.
Yeah, exactly. And one thing, well, it's every season, every year is different, but one smell that I hope that our tour group will get to smell is in Champagne. That's right around the time when the grapes are starting to flower. And it was only, so I can't, no promises because this lasts only a few days. So it's different every year, but that was like, that's an experience I had never had before. So I was doing a lot of my reconnaissance by bike around Reims and Epernay. And thinking to myself, what is that wonderful smell? And I went to one of the museums that we're going to visit, and it's a very interactive museum, and they have all these little squeezy balls where you can squeeze the different grapes and test yourself on which one is which based on their smell. And they had one with the flowers, and so then I realized, I was like, oh, it's the flowers from the Champagne grapes.
Oh wow!
And it's so delicate and really like very ephemeral. So we might get that wonderful treat. We'll see.
Oh, I hope so. It's a beautiful part of the world, so I'm excited to return. I'm just going to share my screen here. So you should be able to see. Can you see that all right?
Yes.
My little slideshow. Perfect. So I would like to start, of course, by thanking Classical Pursuits and all of you for this warm welcome tonight. I hope that this conversation inspires a couple of you to join us on this fabulous tour that we're going to be taking in Champagne in May. So as you know, we're going to be looking on that tour at Paris during the occupation years. And I'd like to tell you a story tonight about a particular museum which, during the war, served as an unwilling host to a collection of artworks that happened to be there as a result of the most significant theft, art theft in modern history. So the museum is called, of course, the Jeu du Paume, and it's the setting for my third novel, The Paris Deception. And The Paris Deception actually opens with this quote from the Hague Convention's Rules of Land Warfare. And I'm going to read it in its entirety because I thought it was so striking that all of the people involved in this theft knew exactly what they were doing. The honors and rights of families, the lives and private property of citizens, as well as religious convictions and practices will be respected. Private property will not be confiscated. So keep that one in the back of your head, because it echoed the entire time that I was writing the novel. So as Melanie mentioned, I am an author of historical fiction. This is my first book, The Woman Before Wallace, which chronicled the life of Thelma Furness, who was a 1930s socialite and aunt to Gloria Vanderbilt, Anderson Cooper's mother, best remembered for leaving her long-term lover, the Prince of Wales, in the trusted hands of her dear friend and fellow American Wallace Simpson when she sailed to New York City to support her sister in the most scandalous custody trial of the interwar period. My second novel, The Last Grand Duchess, chronicled the final days of the Romanov dynasty through the eyes of Olga, the eldest daughter of Nicholas II and Alexandra Fyodorovna, who watches as her world of privilege and power comes crumbling down around her. Third, of course, this book that we're here to talk about tonight is The Paris Deception, which follows a pair of sisters-in-law at serious odds who band together to prevent Jewish-owned works of art from falling into Nazi hands. And then number 4, my newest baby came out actually just around Labor Day, and it chronicles the lives of a newly engaged couple whose future goes up in smoke when the Berlin Wall is erected between them. It seems to be something of a rite of passage, I find, for historical fiction authors to tackle the Second World War. Our collective fascination with the war and all that goes along with it is understandable, especially in recent times where political and social divisions seem so terribly fraught. We can look back, of course, on a time where the good guys won, where people stood up to hatred and fought for the defense of all that they held dear. But of course, the reality of the times was not quite so cut and dry. In countless cases, especially in the early 1940s, evil won the battle, if not the war. And in Nazi-occupied France, there was no guarantee that a bright dawn was going to follow those darkest days. I found this uncertainty to be the appeal of writing about occupied Paris. With the benefit of hindsight, it seems so clear to say that we would do the right thing, but how can we be so sure that in the moment where our backs are against the wall, we wouldn't succumb to the path of least resistance? In The Paris Deception, I explore the enduring impact of the Second World War on Europe's art community, on the gallerists, curators, artists, and patrons who risked their lives to preserve the collections of Europe's Jewish collectors. And in this book, 2 audacious women, Sophie and Fabienne Brandt, strive to save Jewish-owned works of art from destruction, and specifically works of art that were branded degenerate by the Nazi Party. Their mission in my novel is fictional. However, the Nazi notion of degenerate art was all too real, as was the theft of millions of dollars worth of artwork from those perceived to be enemies of the Reich. And I'd like to expand a little bit on that real life history here. And I'll start with giving you a little bit more detail about this notion of degenerate art, also known as entartete Kunst. This was an idea that was developed in the 1920s by the Nazi Party as a response to the perceived decadence and experimentalism that flourished throughout Germany during the Weimar Republic. Upon gaining power in 1933, the Nazis, led by Joseph Goebbels and Hitler, who of course himself was a failed artist, vowed to cleanse Germany of degenerate art and thus of degeneracy itself. This vow resulted in the destruction of thousands of publicly owned works of art in Germany following the 1937 Entartete Kunst exhibition. And this was an exhibition that was intended to educate the German people on the causes of the Weimar Republic's so-called moral decline. But the exhibition itself was a farce. After pulling over 5,000 works of degenerate art from public galleries across Germany, the Reich Chamber of Council selected 650 pieces to serve as the center of an exhibition in Munich in 1937. This was Entartete Kunst, with the word Kunst, meaning artwork, presented in scare quotes. All of these artworks were displayed with deliberate malice. They were unframed, accompanied by derogatory slogans and racial slurs intended to undermine the original intent of the artist. And shown opposite the Entartete Kunst exhibition was the Grosse Deutsche Kunstausstellung, which I'm so sorry for my pronunciation. This was known as the Great German Art Exhibition, and this was a display of what the Reich considered to be ideologically appropriate works of art that aligned with the Nazis' cultural aesthetic. So after touring this exhibition throughout the Reich, the artworks presented in Entartete Kunst, along with over 4,000 other publicly owned works of so-called degenerate art, were piled in front of the Reichstag in Berlin and burned. And this was supposedly to safeguard the German people from falling prey to the revolutionary ideas that this artwork represented. So the question is, of course, what constituted so-called degenerate art? To Hitler, these were works of art that encouraged, and I quote, Judeo-Bolshevik subversion. But today we would call these works of art abstract. These were modern, non-representational works that provided an interpretation of the world that challenged preconceived notions of what the world is and provided instead a glimpse of what the world could be. So some of the artistic styles that were deemed degenerate by the Nazis include Cubism, Fauvism, Expressionism, Impressionism and Post-Impressionism, Surrealism and Dada, and that's only to name a few. Some of the artists who were branded degenerate by the Nazis are those that we consider titans of the art world today: Kirchner and Picasso and Braque, Chagall and Matisse, Van Gogh, Dali, Paul Klee, Max Ernst, Emile Nolde, Fernand Léger, and Juan Miró. All of them were considered degenerates by the Nazis. And of course, an artist could be branded degenerate regardless of the sort of art they created. Gay, Jewish, Black, and female artists were also subject to the scrutiny of these Nazi ideologues, who viewed purely representational, purely European art as the only art that they felt was worthy of note. And I mean, it's really not difficult to see the through line from Hitler's vow to cleanse the world of degenerate art to his determination to eradicate Europe's Jewish population. So how did these paintings end up at the Jeu du Paume? Well, the works of art that were presented in the Entartete Kunst exhibition were from public galleries across Germany. The art that ended up at the Musée Jeu du Paume during the Second World War arrived there through the efforts of the Einsatzstab Reichsleiter Rosenberg, also known as the ERR, which was a Nazi art commission responsible for the theft of an estimated 20% of Europe's artwork, predominantly from Jewish families and collectors forced to flee Europe ahead of the Nazi onslaught. During its 4-year tenure as an unwilling repository for the ERR, an estimated 22,000 works of art, degenerate and otherwise, passed through the Jeu du Paume, pulled from bank vaults, stately homes, apartments, and private galleries all across France. But the ERR was more than a storage facility for the Nazis. Throughout the war, German art connoisseurs, high-ranking Nazi officials, and collaborationist art dealers used the Jeu du Paume and its stolen treasures almost as a shopping mall. They would send the choicest works of art back into the Reich to hang on their own walls without any remuneration for the artwork's rightful owners. Chief among the plunderers, who you see here on the screen facing this work of art, was Reichsmarshal Hermann Göring, Hitler's right-hand man. He visited the Jeu du Paume over 20 times during the course of the war to select 700 works of art to add to his own bloated collection, which in 1945, back then it was valued at over $200 million. Some of the works of art of note that Göring acquired from the Jeu du Paume include Vermeer's Astronomer, seen on the screen, which was rightly owned by Edouard de Rothschild, Van Gogh's Bridge at Langlois and Arles, Velázquez's portrait of the Infanta Maria, Rubens' portrait of Hélène Faumont, and Madame Pompadour by Boucher. Both of these were owned by the Rothschild families. Rembrandt's The Standard Bearer and the portrait of Isabelle Coimont by Franz Hals also ended up in Göring's private collection. And it really is just a shocking thing to consider. 20% of all of Europe's art, which was stolen by the Nazis to hang on their walls in their museums and in their galleries. Today, there's still an ongoing effort by the families of victims to recover their stolen masterpieces, not only from private collections, but also from public institutions, which knowingly or unknowingly acquired artwork of dubious provenance. Many organizations, including the World Jewish Restitution Organization, the Jewish Digital Recovery Project, the ERR Project, the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum, the Claims Conference on Jewish Material Claims Against Germany, and the Monuments Men and Women Foundation. All of these organizations work tirelessly to identify stolen artworks and return them to their rightful owners. But to this day, the fate of an estimated 100,000 works of art looted by the Nazis remains unknown. It still takes my breath away to think about that. 100,000 works of art hidden, destroyed, or waiting to return to the families of their rightful owners. In the 1940s, however, the crimes of the ERR were fresh, and the Germans were seen to be unstoppable. So who amongst Paris's art community resisted? Who among them did what they could do to safeguard the city's cultural heritage? And how do we know today about the sheer extent of the Germans' plunder? While the two main characters in my book, Sophie and Fabienne, are fictional creations, there is a character in the book who was a real-life resistor at the Musée Jeux du Paume during the war. And this was a woman who used her reputation as a wallflower to pass information about the ERR and its dealings onto the French resistance. Rose Valland worked at the Musée Jeux du Paume under the direction of Jacques Gilliard, who was the director of the Musée National de France, and a resistance operative. Both of them are dedicated to safeguarding France's cultural heritage. So despite the constant threat of being discovered, Valland secretly recorded every movement of the ERR within the Jeux du Paume, concealing her ability to speak German in order to monitor and pass information about the ERR's looting onto the resistance. Following the war, Valland worked with the Monuments Men, sharing her records about the ERR's looting with James Rorimer, who was the head of the Monuments Men, sharing her records in order to help locate and return stolen art and artifacts to their rightful owners. And she was doing this under constant threat of discovery. There were multiple times where she was fired and she kept working her way kind of back into the museum because the boiler kept breaking and she was the only one who knew how to fix it. You know, she really was a hero. And at the end of the war, when the Americans came, they suspected her of collaboration and led her through the museum with a gun pressed into her back so that she could show to them that she wasn't hiding Germans in the bowels of the museum's basement. So that's the real life history of the Jeux du Paume. But as those of you who maybe have read the book know, my characters focus on specifically safeguarding degenerate works of art. And these works of art were stored in a little room at the back of the Musée Jeux du Paume known as the Room of Martyrs. This was to keep them separate from the ideologically pure artworks that were desired by the likes of Hermann Göring. As degenerate works of art, the collection in the Room of Martyrs, which you see on the screen here, wasn't as coveted by Göring and his cronies for their own walls, but it was used by Göring's associates, most notably Bruno Lohse, his personal art dealer, to exchange pieces with Swiss and German art dealers. And these dealers would sell the pieces on to unscrupulous collectors across Europe and America, people who either didn't know or didn't care that the art had been stolen from Jewish families and collectors. So, you know, these dealers would basically swap degenerate works of art for pure works of art that Göring could then keep on his walls. And of course, many of the works of art that passed through the Room of Martyrs would be familiar, may be familiar to you today. So Salvador Dali's Swans Reflecting Elephants was prominently displayed in the Room of Martyrs, which I found really interesting because when I was back in university, my roommate got a tattoo of that on her back. And so I remember looking at the sort of photographs of the Room of Martyrs at the time and seeing that piece there and not realizing that I'd been looking at that work of art for years, you know, not realizing its history. Paul Cézanne's Bather in Rocks, which belonged to the French collector Alphonse Kahn. Van Gogh's iconic self-portrait. This was part of the Room of Martyrs too. It belonged to gallerist Paul Rosenberg, as did Pablo Picasso's portrait of Madame Rosenberg and her child. Both of these were owned by the French gallerist who later moved to the States, Paul Rosenberg. Flipped it too quick. Monet, Renoir, Degas, Braque, Delacroix, Clément, all of these artists were represented in the Room of Martyrs. And this is the collection that my main characters, recognizing what befell the degenerate works of art in Germany, seek to save by replacing the originals with skillful forgeries. So how does one go about fictionalizing such a rich history? First of all, I needed a character to be my eyes and ears within the Jeu du Paume, someone who could work alongside Rose Valland and take a special interest in the degenerate collection. She would need to have a specialized enough skill set in order to avoid being dismissed at the start of the war, and she needed a thorough knowledge of the German language. So I decided to make her an art conservator, a restorer in the 1940s parlance, whose professional abilities would be of interest to an art commission known for damaging the paintings that they looted from Jewish families. You know, it's a bit of an oddity in the publishing industry that you can sell a book based on a single sentence or like a single paragraph of detail. So it's really easy in the early stages of plot development to kind of yada yada some of the particulars of what you need your characters to do. You know, you go, okay, yeah, one's an art conservator, one's a forger, and you sell the book based on these characters that you've sketched in thin air. But then the real work begins, because before I began to research this novel in earnest, I didn't have much of an understanding of what an art conservator does. But in order to portray her convincingly, I had to learn, and I had to learn really quick. My solution came through a personal connection. My old university roommate, who put me in touch with a friend of hers who works in the conservation community in New York City. So in the span of a single email, doors opened for me. I flew to New York and I was given private tours of the art conservation labs at the Museum of Natural History, the Metropolitan Museum of Art, and the Museum of Modern Art, MoMA. I learned about the history of art conservation and how attitudes towards conservation have changed from the 1940s and how that would have informed Sophie's mentality around her work. Back then, the watchword for conservators was to make things look pretty rather than acknowledging the entire history of an artwork. And looking at that history as part of the artwork's DNA. I learned about the sort of tools that a conservator in the 1940s would have at her disposal, and how conservators rely on different materials and conservation paints so that their work can be recognized and removed by future conservators. I was also introduced to the meticulous and respectful process of conserving religious objects and artifacts at the Museum of Natural History. And I was shown a Van Gogh partway through a conservation treatment at MoMA, right up close behind the velvet curtain, so to speak, which was really, really a privilege. So once I'd kind of gotten my feet under me with the conservation side of the book, I needed to determine how my characters might convincingly forge these works of art. I started initially by looking into the history of the real-life art forger Han van Meegeren, who sold a fake Vermeer to Hermann Göring in 1943, to determine how van Meegeren convinced art connoisseurs and Nazis alike that his rather middling attempts at Vermeers were authentic. And here he is. He's got his forgery behind him, which even from this distance looks absolutely nothing like a Vermeer. His method of forgery involved actually mixing Bakelite, an early thermoplastic, into oil paints in order to harden the paint. And then he'd crack the canvas over a table edge to give it the necessary craquelure to mimic a 16th century painting. However, had I borrowed his backlight method for the modern works in the Paris Deception, the paint would have hardened too much. Remember, the paintings that Sophie and Fabien were forging were only 20 to 30, maybe 50 years old at the top end at the time of the war. So I studied the drying times of different oils used in oil paints, linseed and lilac and walnut, which is a process actually that Fabienne recreates for herself in the Paris Deception, wondering whether one or another might work, but this resulted in a dead end. And I have to tell you, I was panicking at this point in the writing process because I'd sold the book. I was partway through writing it, and then I realized my method of forgery was not going to work. And what do? You have to figure it out. So instead, what I did is I started looking into the development of acrylic paint. So acrylic resin was first developed in 1934 by a German chemist named Otto Rahm, who used it to create synthetic paint for industrial uses. So think house paint and painting the wings of airplanes. But thanks to its versatility and its ability to mimic the qualities of oil or watercolor paint, artists began to use this acrylic paint for artistic purposes in the late 1940s. And this was most notably actually in South America at first. So Diego Rivera, for instance, was a very early adopter of the medium. In 1947, a mineral spirit-based, meaning acrylic paint, was developed by Bocur Artist Colors. This was called Magnaplastic Colors. And a similar formulation, MSA Conservation Color, which is on the screen right here, was developed by Golden Artist Colors. And this is the painting that's used by art conservators today. So these formulations were the inspiration for the acrylics that Sophie ends up creating in the Paris Deception. But you've got to bear in mind the challenge in forging a work of art goes beyond the obvious need for paint and artistic skill. Not only does a painting need to look convincing, it also has to act like a painting of its time and place. So this means not only putting the right brushstrokes in the right place, it means having the right canvases, supports, and indications of wear and tear to make the entire illusion convincing. Excuse me. So for these details, I turn to contemporary sources, art forgers who've shared their tips and tricks over the years. I relied very predominantly on Eric Hebborn's Art Forger's Handbook, which was yanked out of print almost as soon as it was put into print because it was too detailed. Hebborn was one of the most successful art forgers of all time, and he earned over $30 million from his forgery. And as I said, his book was pulled out of print because the techniques he provided were too detailed. So I was able to get a copy of it. I maybe went down the dark web a little bit to find it, which was a very interesting experience. But you know, it's such a fascinating read because he discusses using authentic canvases where possible. So grinding down the original painting so that the canvas itself will show age when you flip it over. He talks about using rusted nails to tack the painting to its stretcher and advises rubbing India ink and vacuum cleaner dust, which he refers to in the book as the dust of ages, very delightfully. He talks about rubbing that into the painting's craquelure and its supports to give it that added level of authenticity and grime. I was also able to speak to an actual art forger who I met during the course of researching this time period. He slyly mentioned during our conversation that he'd forged several paintings in his time. So I was able to kind of grill him for details on forgery straight from the source, so to speak. And this is one of the privileges of being an author. You know, you're a jack of all trades and a master of none. We don't always have the luxury of being able to step directly into our character's shoes professionally, but having access to these kinds of subject matter experts, like the conservators, like the foragers, really gives us unique insights into how our characters might think, feel, and approach their lives. We get to learn about these different industries and professions that don't necessarily align with our own experiences and live momentarily within their world. As the saying goes, good artists borrow, great artists steal. And when we're lucky, writers get to consult the experts when we need to get our characters out of corners that we've painted ourselves into. So finally, I needed a place for my characters to stash these rescued originals. And after learning about the Champagne region's role in the French resistance, I couldn't resist leaning into it. So the Champagne region has its own remarkable history during the Second World War. And I touch on this at scenes set in Fabienne's fictional family home, which is a down on its luck champagne house, which I call Chateau d'Aulis. Chateau d'Aulis was a fictional lens through which to explore this real life history. So Champagne, both the region and the drink, was a highly coveted prize when the Germans occupied part of France. And they wasted very little time in bringing the winemaking industry under their control. The Germans appointed a regional overseer known as a Weinführer to ensure that the champagne houses could keep up with the increasingly unreasonable demands of the Nazi high command for their absolute best vintages. Unbeknownst to the wine Führer, however, the champagne houses were heavily, heavily involved in resistance activities. And some of these activities were on the smaller scale, such as swapping labels to pass off their worst grape juice as Grand Cru vintages. But a lot of them were actually larger scale, such as housing downed Allied pilots and concealing arsenals for the French resistance. Robert Jean de Vogue, who's the head of Moët Chandon, as you can see on the screen here, he was actually arrested by the Germans for his covert work as the leader of the regional French resistance. So he would pass off information about champagne orders, whispers about where the Germans wanted large orders of champagne, which de Vogue quickly realized were sites where the Germans were hoping to attain quick victories. And he'd pass this information on to de Gaulle and the Allied leadership. So, for instance, one of the big orders that the Germans had the champagne houses packing was they wanted it to be packed specially to withstand high heat. And de Vogue realized that what they meant by this was they were going to start a Nazi invasion in northern Africa. So he was able, through his network, to pass this information on to de Gaulle, and they ensured that that Nazi victory in northern Africa never happened. One of my other favorite resistance stories, dealing with champagne, absolute favorite, involves the head of the house of which one was she? I think she was Tattinger. And she was similar to the widow Clicquot. She was a woman who was in charge and running this champagne house in the 1940s. And the wine Führer, Otto Rahm, really, really liked her champagne house. And he would come and he'd sit in her office and bloviate for hours. And she would have to sit there and listen to him and hated every minute of it. So she ended up having a very small chair made for her office because Otto Rahm was a rather portly man, and she had a chair made that was too small for him to fit in, and brought him into her office. The next time he came over, he looked at the chair, realized he wouldn't be able to sit, and she kept him there, grilling him for hours. Oh no, you must tell me about this. You must tell me about that. Kept him there for hours standing on his feet until finally he left and never came back. So that's one of my absolute favorite little champagne stories. So writing a novel like The Paris Deception is such a privilege because not only do I get to do what I love best, which is write about things that fascinate me, but also because the history that I write about in this book is still so pertinent today. To this day, the legacy of the Second World War on the art world and the world at large, of course, persists. Organizations like the Monuments Men and Women Foundation and the ERR Project continue to work tirelessly to return works of art and cultural artifacts to their rightful owners. And Nazi-looted art continues to surface from time to time. So, for example, there was a recovery of over 1,200 works of art from German art dealer Hildebrand Gerlitz's son in 2014. There was a recent settlement reached by the Boston Museum of Fine Arts over Van Ostad that had been sold under duress by a Jewish art dealer, Paul Gropp, in 1941. So cases like these will and should continue to come to light until those 100,000 works of art are finally accounted for and returned to their rightful owners. So I told you that I made Sophie an art restorer because I needed a character who could act as my eyes and ears within the Jeu du Paume. But there was a second reason for that, which lies in her own profession. Of course, she works as a restorer, and it felt right to have a character who was working to restore artwork in multiple senses of the word. On the canvas, yes, but also in a broader sense, restoring it to the owners of that artwork originally. The nature of resistance can take on so many forms after all. And as Sophie points out in the pages of this book, she's not one to take up arms and fight in the streets. And the reality of the matter was that many people within occupied Europe weren't in a position to fight outright. But she stood up for what she believed in, and she used her art as her method of resistance. Her art was a means of doing the right thing, and it was a means of saving artwork and bringing to light the crimes of the past. So I hope that my own work of art, my book, can serve a similar purpose in illuminating the dark history of the war on the art world. And I hope that we can dive further into that history in France in May. So it's been an absolute privilege to write this novel and to get to share a little bit about the history behind it here today. And I cannot wait to return to Sophie and Fabienne's world in May with Classical Pursuits. And I so hope that you can join us. And Melanie, open to some questions, open to a little chatting. Yeah, so I will stop sharing my screen now, but thank you all for letting me hop up on the soapbox.
Yes, absolutely. Thank you so much, Bryn. That was fantastic. I learned, we were lucky to have Bryn at Toronto Pursuits in 2023 talking about this book. And each time you talk about it, I learn more and more. Yeah, it's just, thank you so much. And we would love to have, so Bryn and I will be on the tour. Bryn will be our very special host. I will be taking care of logistics, and then we'll have our two Paris-based, well, in Paris, we'll have Lisa and Samuel, and we'll have Stéphane with us in Champagne. It's going to be fantastic. So I'll give everybody a moment to put in some questions into the chat. Before I turn off the recording, just for those who are listening, because we're going to put this up, share this with everyone who couldn't be here tonight. Again, please join Bryn and me for Art and Resistance in World War II, Paris and Champagne, May 15th to 24th. You can find all the info on our website. We have lots more free programs and some seminars coming up about this tour over the fall. And all of that information is on the website. So I'm going to turn off the recording now.